Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going deeper than the headlines to explore how power really works in Iran. You've given us some fascinating sources to work with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. From historical analysis all the way to on-the-ground reports about these recent military events, it looks like we're getting the full picture of what's happening over there.
We are, and I think to really understand the events, we need to connect them to the underlying power structures within Iran.
Okay.
The things that we're seeing unfold right now are direct consequences of decisions that were made decades ago. So understanding that history is really going to be key to anticipating what might happen next.
All right, so let's dive into that history. We'll start with the 1979 revolution. Most people have heard of Ayatollah Khomeini,
Right.
but the HW, he actually rose to power, I think, is full of surprises. It wasn't as simple as, him just stepping off the plane and taking charge.
No, not at all. He was a very shrewd politician, and when he returned from exile, it was an electric atmosphere.
Yeah.
Huge crowds, the Shah's regime crumbling, but instead of just grabbing power outright, he played a much longer game.
So that's where this idea of velayat-e-faqih comes in, right?
Yes.
It's the concept that Islamic clerics should rule.
Yeah, but it's not just a concept, it's a very carefully constructed framework for power.
Okay.
He didn't just claim religious authority, he argued that clerics were uniquely qualified to interpret Islamic law, and therefore best suited to govern.
I see.
And this really resonated with a lot of Iranians who were disillusioned with the Shah's Western-leaning policies.
So he was really playing to the people's desire for change, but also laying the groundwork for his own authority at the same time.
Exactly. And he used that groundwork very brilliantly. He knew that Iran was deeply divided after the revolution.
Right.
There were various factions, Kurds, Marxists, different religious groups, all vying for influence. So a more direct power grab could have easily backfired.
Sure.
So instead, he used a series of really shrewd political maneuvers.
Okay, so what did those maneuvers look like? How did he outmaneuver all these other groups?
Well, first, he organized a referendum on whether Iran should become an Islamic republic, right?
Uh-huh.
And you might think, well, of course, that would pass. It was a revolution.
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing is the initial draft constitution that was being circulated at the time was actually quite progressive.
Oh, wow.
It even included provisions for women's rights.
So he supported a progressive constitution and then held a referendum for an Islamic republic?
Yes.
Why would he do that?
It was a very clever way to gauge public sentiment and also consolidate support.
Okay.
The referendum passed with over 98% approval, which gave him a very powerful mandate to then push his agenda forward. And then he dismantled the very process that produced that progressive constitution.
Oh, wow. So talk about playing the long game. What happened to that original constitution?
He essentially scrapped it. He canceled the Constituent Assembly that was supposed to ratify it, and instead he created a new body called the Assembly of Experts, which he packed with his loyalists.
Oh, okay.
And this assembly then rewrote the Constitution, enshrining the concept of velayat-e-faqih and giving Khomeini ultimate power as the supreme leader.
So essentially, he used the democratic process, the referendum, the assemblies, to subvert democracy and establish his own authority.
Precisely. And that's one of the great paradoxes, I think, of the Iranian Revolution. It began as a popular uprising against authoritarian rule, but ended up creating a new form of authoritarianism rooted in religious ideology.
And this really gets to the heart of why understanding this history matters today, because this power structure, with the supreme leader at the apex, has been a defining feature of Iran ever since.
Absolutely. It's the foundation upon which the entire political system is built, and it's directly relevant to understanding current events like the recent Israeli airstrikes and the internal tensions that we see within Iran.
Okay.
To understand those, we need to kind of dive into this labyrinth of Iran's political institutions,
Right.
starting with this deceptive balance of power that they create.
Because when you look at Iran's government on paper, it seems very complex. You've got the president, the parliament, the guardian council, this assembly of experts. It's almost dizzying.
It is designed to be dizzying. That complexity is part of how the system maintains its grip on power.
Okay.
It creates this illusion of checks and balances, which might lead an outsider to think, hey, maybe Iran is a democracy after all.
But that's not the reality, is it?
Not even close.
Okay.
While there are elections, there are different branches of government. Ultimate power really flows from the supreme leader and the institutions that he controls.
I see.
So take the Guardian Council, for example.
Okay.
It's appointed by the supreme leader, And it has the power to veto laws passed by parliament
Wow.
and even disqualify candidates from running for office.
So even when a more moderate president like Khatami or Rouhani gets elected, they're essentially walking a tightrope.
Exactly. They're constantly navigating a
Yeah.
system that's rigged against them.
Right.
The Guardian Council makes sure that hardliners maintain a firm grip on the levers of power, and they're not afraid to use that power to shape the outcome of elections.
And we've seen this play out in recent history, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the 1997 and 2021 elections are prime examples.
Hmm.
In both cases, you had this surge of hope for reform. Moderate candidates gaining significant momentum, but the Guardian Council steps in, disqualifies many of them,
Right.
and paves the way for hardliner victories.
So for people within Iran who are pushing for change, it must feel incredibly frustrating, like the system is designed to shut them out.
And that's exactly the sentiment that's expressed by many, particularly younger generations, who crave greater freedom, a more open society.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, this system as it stands is built to resist those kinds of changes.
It's a system that was very carefully crafted by Khomeini, and it has proven remarkably resilient over the decades.
And that resilience is being tested now more than ever.
Yeah.
The recent Israeli airstrikes bring a whole new dimension to this power struggle, both internally and in terms of Iran's place on the global stage.
Because it's clear these strikes aren't just a tit-for-tat response to the missiles that Iran launched towards Israel earlier this month.
No, not at all. There's something much bigger at play here.
Okay.
Israel is sending a very clear message that they're stepping up their game and they're willing to take a more aggressive approach to contain Iran.
And some of our sources suggest that these strikes could be setting the stage for something even bigger down the line,
Possibly.
potentially targeting Iran's oil and nuclear infrastructure.
It's a very dangerous game of escalation. The stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
And to really understand what's going on, we need to actually examine the specific targets that Israel chose
Oh, okay.
and what they reveal about their strategic objectives.
Let's do that. What can you tell us about these targets? What might Israel be trying to achieve?
Well, if we look closely at the reports and the analysis, it appears that Israel is trying to do a few key things.
Okay.
First, they're attempting to degrade Iran's military capabilities, not just by responding to immediate threats, but by weakening their long-term potential.
So this isn't about retaliation. It's about trying to cripple Iran's ability to, project power in the future.
Exactly. And they're doing that in a few ways. For one, they've been targeting air defense systems,
All right.
which, if successful, would make future strikes against Iran easier and less risky.
I see.
They've also been hitting missile production facilities and other sites that are associated with the IRGC.
Now, the IRGC, it's not just any military branch, right?
Yeah.
They're a very powerful force with deep ties to the regime.
That's right. They're essentially a parallel military force,
Okay.
answered directly to the supreme leader. They wield significant political and economic power within Iran,
I see.
and their loyalty is unquestioned.
So by attacking the IRGC, Israel's really going after the heart of the regime's power,
They are.
sending a message that goes far beyond just military capabilities.
Absolutely. It's a bold move and one that carries significant risks. It can provoke a strong response from Iran, potentially pushing them towards a more aggressive stance, both domestically and internationally.
And that brings us to the big question. How will Iran respond?
Right.
Publicly, they're downplaying the damage,
They are.
but they must be feeling the pressure.
They are, and they're facing a complex dilemma.
Right.
On the one hand, they can't afford to appear weak. They need to project strength, both to their own people and to their allies in the region.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, a strong military response could lead to further escalation with Israel and potentially draw in other regional powers.
It's a tough spot to be in,
Yeah,
especially with their economy already struggling and internal dissent on the rise.
absolutely. And as we dig deeper into these strikes and their potential consequences, we'll see how those internal power struggles within Iran really play a crucial role in shaping their response. It really is a high-stakes balancing act for them.
Yeah.
They need to project strength to their own people and to their allies in the region. But at the same time, they can't afford further escalation with Israel.
Right, especially with their economy already struggling. And we know that Iran's political system isn't exactly monolithic.
Right.
So how are these strikes playing into those internal power struggles?
That's a really key point to consider.
Yeah.
Because you see, Iran's political system, while it's designed to maintain a balance between different factions, it's now under immense strain. And these strikes are exacerbating those tensions.
Okay.
It's creating this tug of war between hardliners and more moderate elements within the regime.
So who's pulling which way?
Well, the hardliners, the ones who advocate for a more confrontational approach to Israel in the West, they see these strikes as a rallying point.
I see.
They're likely to push for a very strong response, potentially through their network of proxies, like Hezbollah.
Right.
And they could use this to further consolidate their own power, arguing that Iran needs to strengthen its defenses and stand up to its enemies.
Which could lead to a very dangerous cycle of escalation, with Hezbollah attacks triggering, devastating Israeli counterstrikes.
Exactly. But on the other side, you have more moderate voices within the Iranian government.
Right.
And they understand the risks of a full-blown conflict.
Yeah.
They might argue for a more measured response,
Okay.
focusing on diplomatic channels or covert operations.
Mm-hmm.
They'll likely emphasize the need to protect Iran's economy and avoid further international isolation.
So it's almost like we're seeing two competing narratives emerge within Iran.
Precisely.
One pushing for confrontation, the other for caution.
Exactly. And the outcome of this internal struggle will have significant implications for the region.
Yeah.
A more aggressive response from Iran could destabilize the entire Middle East,
Right.
potentially drawing in other countries and leading to a wider conflict.
And we can't forget about the impact on the Iranian people themselves. They're already facing economic hardship and political repression.
Yes,
A war would only make things worse.
absolutely. A war would be devastating for the Iranian people,
Yeah.
leading to further suffering and potentially even fueling more unrest and dissent.
Mm-hmm.
It's a scenario that even the hardliners would likely want to avoid, especially with their grip on power already facing challenges.
So where do we go from here? What's the most likely outcome?
It's hard to predict with certainty, but I think it's safe to say that we're entering a period of heightened tension and uncertainty.
Yeah.
The potential for escalation is very real, but there are also factors that could push for de-escalation.
Like what are the forces that might prevent things from spiraling out of control?
Well, international pressure is a key factor.
Okay.
The U.S. and other world powers have a vested interest in preventing a wider conflict in the Middle East.
Right.
So they might use diplomatic channels to try to bring both sides back from the brink,
Mm-hmm.
urging restraint and dialogue.
And what about the economic factor? We know that Iran's economy is already under immense strain due to sanctions. Wouldn't a war make that situation exponentially worse?
It would, precisely.
Yeah.
A war would be economically disastrous for Iran.
Right.
It would disrupt oil exports, further damage infrastructure,
Uh-huh.
and likely lead to even tighter sanctions.
So even the hardliners who, prioritize ideological purity and confrontation
Yeah,
might hesitate to risk further economic ruin,
they might.
especially with public discontent already simmering.
Exactly. It's a complex calculation for Iran.
Yeah.
They need to weigh the potential costs and benefits of different responses,
Mm-hmm.
considering not just the military and political dimensions, but also the economic and social consequences.
Right. And that's where, your deep dive into these sources becomes really crucial.
It does.
By understanding these complexities, the historical context, the internal dynamics of Iran, and the regional power dynamics,
Right.
you're better equipped to make informed judgments about what might happen next. It's almost like having a front row seat to a high-stakes geopolitical thriller, but this is real life, with real consequences.
It is. And as we move forward, I think it's important to keep a few key things in mind.
Okay.
First, watch how Iran chooses to respond.
Right.
What actions do they take? What rhetoric are they using?
Yeah.
Are they signaling a willingness to de-escalate, or are they preparing for further confrontation?
So we should be looking for clues, both in their actions and their words, to see which way they're leaning.
Exactly.
Okay, what else should we be paying attention to?
Keep a close eye on the international community.
Okay.
How are other countries reacting to these strikes?
Mm-hmm.
Are they condemning Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Are they supporting Iran? Or are they trying to mediate?
Right.
The reactions of key players like the U.S., Russia, and China will be very telling.
Yeah.
Their actions and statements could really influence how the situation unfolds.
And of course, we need to watch what's happening in the region itself, right? Are there signs of instability or violence spreading to other countries, especially those where Iran has a strong presence?
Exactly. Pay attention to reports coming out of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
and other places where Iran has allies and proxies.
Yeah.
Any signs of escalation in those areas could be a red flag, suggesting that the conflict is expanding.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is.
But it's essential information if we want to understand how this situation might unfold
It is.
and what it means for global security.
Right. And remember, this is just a starting point.
Yeah.
The more you delve into these sources, exploring different perspectives and connecting the dots, the better you'll be able to navigate this complex and ever-changing landscape.
So let's dive into some of the potential consequences of these strikes,
Okay.
both within Iran and for the wider region.
Right.
What are the key things that we should be watching for in the coming weeks and months?
One key thing to watch is how these strikes impact the already fragile prospect of reviving the nuclear deal. The Biden administration had been trying to re-engage with Iran, but these attacks have created a much more hostile atmosphere.
It's hard to imagine Iran sitting down at the negotiating table while Israel is bombing their military facilities.
It is.
And even if they did, would the U.S. Congress be willing to lift sanctions in this climate?
It's highly unlikely.
Okay.
The hardliners within Iran, they'll likely be emboldened by the strikes, and they'll use this as further justification for their opposition to the deal.
Right.
They'll argue that it's proof that the West can't be trusted
Mm-hmm.
and that Iran needs to strengthen its defenses, potentially even pushing for a renewed push for nuclear development.
Which could lead to, a very dangerous spiral,
It could.
further increasing tensions with Israel in the West.
Exactly. And it's not just the nuclear deal that's at stake here.
Right.
These strikes could also have a ripple effect on regional alliances.
Okay.
Iran has a network of allies and proxies across the Middle East,
Yeah.
from Hezbollah in Lebanon to various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria.
And these groups could be drawn into the conflict,
They could.
either by direct orders from Iran or even by acting on their own initiative.
Right.
This could quickly escalate into a multi-front conflict.
Precisely. And that's a nightmare scenario that Israel and the U.S. are desperate to avoid.
Yeah.
They don't want to get bogged down in another protracted war in the Middle East.
Right.
The question is, can they contain the situation and prevent it from spiraling out of control?
It seems like a lot of this hinges on what happens within Iran itself.
It does.
If the hardliners gain the upper hand and push for a more confrontational response, the risk of a wider conflict increases significantly.
You're right.
Yeah.
The internal power dynamics of Iran are absolutely crucial in determining the trajectory of this conflict.
It's a lot to process, but I'm starting to see how interconnected everything is.
It is a complex web. And it really highlights why understanding the history and the internal power struggles within Iran is so important. It gives you that framework for making sense of these events and anticipating what might come next.
Speaking of what might come next, what are some specific things that we should be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
Okay.
What are the key indicators that things might be escalating or de-escalating?
Well, first and foremost, keep a close eye on how Iran responds.
Okay.
Do they retaliate directly against Israel? Do they activate their proxies in the region?
Mm-hmm.
Or do they opt for a more measured response, focusing on diplomacy or covert action?
Right.
The type of response they choose will be a very strong indicator of their intentions and their assessment of the situation.
And what about the rhetoric coming out of Tehran? Are they doubling down on their hardline stance? Or are they signaling any openness to dialogue and de-escalation?
The tone and content of their statements, both from political leaders and from state-controlled media, will be very revealing.
Okay.
Are they emphasizing national unity and defiance in the face of aggression?
Right.
Or are they hinting at any willingness to negotiate a way out of this crisis?
I see.
These are the subtle but crucial signals to watch for.
Okay, so we need to pay attention to both their actions and their words.
Yes.
What else should we be looking for?
Keep a close eye on the nuclear program.
Right.
Are there any indications that Iran is accelerating its uranium enrichment
Mm-hmm.
or taking other steps that might be perceived as provocative by Israel and the West?
Yeah.
This would be a major red flag,
Right.
suggesting that they're moving further away from diplomacy and towards confrontation.
And what about the regional dynamics? Are we seeing any signs of Iran's proxies mobilizing or becoming more active?
Absolutely. Any uptick in activity from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq,
Yeah.
or Houthi rebels in Yemen
Right.
should be taken very seriously.
Yeah.
It could indicate that Iran is trying to open up new fronts in the conflict,
Right.
drawing in other actors and widening the scope of the violence.
It's like we're watching a very dangerous game of chess, with each move having the potential to trigger a chain reaction with unpredictable consequences.
It's a very apt analogy,
Yeah.
and it highlights the need for careful observation and nuanced analysis.
Right.
because it really is a complex situation.
So as we move forward, we need to be mindful of all these factors,
Mm.
paying attention to the signals coming from Iran, the responses from the international community,
Yeah,
and any shifts in the regional landscape.
exactly. It's a complex and evolving situation.
Yeah.
And staying informed is really the first step toward understanding the potential risks and implications.
Right, and as we've discussed, this isn't just about geopolitics and military strategy.
No,
There are real people's lives at stake,
there are.
both in Iran and across the region.
Absolutely.
The decisions made by leaders in Tehran, Jerusalem, and Washington will have a profound impact on millions of people.
They will.
We need to keep those human stories in mind as we try to make sense of this complex and often confusing situation.
We do.
So as we move into our final segment,
Okay.
let's shift our focus to the potential long-term consequences of these strikes. What might the ripple effects be both within Iran and for the wider region?
One of the most significant potential consequences is a further tightening of the regime's grip on power within Iran.
Okay.
They'll likely use these strikes as a pretext to crack down on dissent, to silence opposition voices, and to strengthen their security apparatus.
So, in a way, these strikes could play right into the hands of the hardliners,
They could.
giving them the justification they need to suppress any calls for reform or liberalization.
That's a very real concern.
Yeah.
It could create a more repressive environment within Iran,
Mm-hmm.
pushing the country further away from any hope of democratic change.
What a bleak outlook for those hoping for a more open and democratic Iran.
It is, and the implications extend far beyond Iran's borders.
Right.
These strikes could further deepen the divide between Iran and its Arab neighbors,
Okay.
particularly those in the Gulf.
Right. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have long been wary of Iran's influence in the region,
They have.
and these strikes will only reinforce their fears.
Exactly. They might see this as a sign that Iran is becoming more aggressive, more unpredictable, pushing them to strengthen their own defenses and alliances with countries like Israel and the U.S.
So we could see a realignment of power in the region, with these strikes acting as a catalyst for new alliances and a hardening of existing divisions.
That's a distinct possibility, and it's something that policymakers in Washington and other capitals will be watching very closely.
It's like a giant chessboard, with each move having far-reaching consequences that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of the battlefield, what do you think Israel's ultimate goals are with these strikes?
Right.
Are they hoping to deter Iran, to weaken them militarily, or to achieve something else entirely?
Their primary objective is likely a combination of deterrence and degradation.
Okay.
They want to make it clear to Iran that there's a price to pay for their actions, whether it's launching missiles, supporting proxies, or advancing their nuclear program. They're aiming to raise the cost of those actions, hoping to force Iran to reconsider its strategy.
But is it really working? Isn't this just fueling the cycle of violence, making a wider conflict more likely?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
Some argue that these strikes are necessary to send a strong message
Right.
and to prevent Iran from becoming even more emboldened. They believe that a show of force is the only language that Iran understands.
But others worry that this is a dangerous game of escalation that could easily backfire.
Exactly. And there's no easy answer.
Right.
It's a complex calculation with a lot of unknowns.
Yeah.
We don't know how Iran will respond in the long term,
Uh-huh.
or how these strikes will impact that delicate balance of power in the region.
So what can we do? As individuals who are trying to make sense of all of this, how can we stay informed and engaged without getting overwhelmed by the complexity?
I think the most important thing is to stay curious, to keep learning,
Yeah.
and to engage in critical thinking.
Okay.
Don't just accept what you hear at face value.
Right.
Question assumptions, seek out different perspectives, and try to connect the dots.
And be wary of information overload.
You need to.
There's a lot of noise out there, especially on social media with competing narratives and agendas.
Absolutely. Be discerning about your sources, check facts,
Mm.
and don't be afraid to ask questions.
And most importantly, remember that this isn't just an abstract geopolitical game.
It's not.
There are real people's lives at stake.
Yes, the decisions made by leaders in Tehran, Jerusalem, and Washington will have a profound impact on millions of people across the Middle East.
So to bring it back to our deep dive, what are some specific things that you, our listener, can be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
Okay.
What are the key indicators that things are moving in one direction or another?
Keep an eye on how Iran responds.
Okay.
What actions do they take, and what rhetoric are they using?
Hmm.
Are they signaling a willingness to de-escalate,
Right.
or are they preparing for further confrontation?
And what about the international community? How are other countries reacting to these strikes? Are they condemning Israel, supporting Iran, or trying to mediate?
The reactions of key players like the U.S., Russia, and China will be very telling.
Yeah.
Their actions and statements could influence how the situation unfolds.
And of course, we need to keep watching the situation in the region itself.
Right.
Are we seeing signs of instability or violence spreading to other countries?
Pay attention to reports coming out of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq,
You're right.
and other places where Iran has influence.
Okay.
Any signs of escalation in those areas could indicate a wider conflict brewing.
It's a lot to keep track of, but it's essential information for anyone who wants to understand the complexities of the Middle East
It is.
and the potential implications for global security.
And as always, remember that this is just a starting point.
Yeah.
We encourage you to delve deeper into these topics, to explore different sources,
Bro,
and to form your own informed opinions.
that's what the deep dive is all about.
It is.
Empowering you with knowledge.
Encouraging you to think critically.
And hopefully sparking your curiosity along the way.
Now, before we move on to our final segment,
Okay.
let's pause for a moment and consider what's resonating with you the most from our discussion so far.
Right.
What insights or connections are standing out to you?
Yeah.
What questions are you grappling with?
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are processing a lot of information right now. It's like we've peeled back the layers of this onion, revealing the intricate workings of Iran's power structure and how these strikes are shaking things up.
Yeah, it's a complex situation, and as we move forward, I think it's really crucial to consider the potential long-term consequences of these strikes,
Right.
both for Iran and for the wider region.
Right, because the immediate aftermath is just one part of the story. So what might the ripple effects be down the line?
Well, within Iran, we need to think about the impact on the regime's grip on power.
Right.
These strikes could embolden the hardliners, giving them a pretext to crack down on really any form of dissent and further tighten their control.
So those who are hoping for a more open and democratic Iran might find their hopes dashed.
They might.
Yeah, as the regime uses this situation to consolidate its power.
That's a very real possibility.
Yeah.
They might use the strikes as justification to increase surveillance, restrict freedoms, silence opposition voices,
Wow.
arguing that national security demands a firmer hand.
It's a chilling thought, and it raises questions about what this means for the future of Iranian society.
Yeah.
If the hardliners solidify their grip, what hope is there for those who desire change?
It's a very difficult question, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
The path towards a more open and democratic Iran was already fraught with challenges.
Right.
And these strikes could make that path even steeper.
It's a reminder that these events have very real consequences for people's lives.
They do.
For their aspirations for a better future.
Yeah.
But it's not just about Iran's internal dynamics, is it? What about the wider regional impact?
Right. These strikes have the potential to reshape the geopolitical landscape of the entire Middle East.
Okay.
For one, they could further deepen the divide between Iran and its Arab neighbors,
Yeah.
especially those in the Gulf,
Right.
who have long been wary of Iran's ambitions.
So countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE,
Right.
they might see these strikes as a confirmation of their fears.
They might.
And push them to strengthen their ties with Israel and potentially even forming new alliances.
That's a very likely outcome.
Yeah.
They might view Iran as an increasingly unpredictable and dangerous actor,
Right.
prompting them to seek closer security cooperation with Israel and the U.S.
As a counterbalance.
as a counterbalance. Exactly.
And wouldn't that just reinforce the existing divisions in the region?
It would.
Making it even harder to find common ground and resolve these long-standing conflicts?
Absolutely. It could create a more polarized and militarized environment, increasing the risk of future confrontations and making it even more challenging to achieve, lasting peace and stability.
Yeah, it paints a rather bleak picture.
It does.
A region even more divided, with the potential for, more conflict, more instability.
It's a concerning scenario, for sure, but it's not inevitable.
Okay.
There are forces at play that could push in a different direction
Right.
towards de-escalation and dialogue.
What would those look like? Where might we find, some glimmers of hope in this complex situation?
Well, for one, the international community has a role to play.
Okay.
Countries like Russia and China, who have traditionally maintained closer ties with Iran,
Right.
they might use their influence to encourage restraint and urge a return to diplomacy.
So there's a chance that even in this tense climate, diplomacy could still offer a path out of this crisis.
It's a slim hope, but it's worth holding on to.
Yeah.
And within Iran itself, there might be voices of moderation, even within the corridors of power,
Right.
who understand the dangers of escalation and are willing to work, maybe behind the scenes, to find a way to de-escalate the situation.
So it's not a foregone conclusion that the hardliners will just completely dominate the narrative and dictate Iran's response.
Right, the situation is fluid,
Okay.
and there are still forces pushing in different directions.
Yeah.
The coming weeks and months will be crucial in determining which forces prevail.
And that brings us back to you, our listener.
It does.
You've taken this deep dive to gain, a deeper understanding of this complex situation.
Yes.
And now you're equipped to follow these developments with a more informed perspective.
Hopefully.
You've gone beyond the headlines, you've delved into the historical context, explored these intricate power dynamics at play.
Right.
And armed with this knowledge, you can be more discerning about the information you encounter,
You can.
more critical of the narratives you're presented with, and more engaged in the conversations about how this situation unfolds.
Absolutely. Remember, the future of the Middle East, and indeed the world,
Yeah.
is shaped not just by the actions of leaders, but also by the awareness and engagement of individuals like you.
So as you continue to learn and explore, keep in mind the human cost of these conflicts.
Yes.
The lives that are affected, the hopes that are at stake.
Right.
Let those stories guide your understanding and inform your actions.
And never underestimate the power of informed individuals to make a difference in the world.
Keep asking questions, keep seeking knowledge,
Yeah.
and keep diving deep.
Keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.